Dear students, in the previous module we learnt about a few types of research. In this module we will discuss and gain knowledge about the observational studies and cohort studies, by which you will be able to understand the intricacies of application to population study. The learning objectives concerned to this module are observational studies, meaning and importance, types of observational studies, strength and weaknesses of observational studies, cohort studies, meaning, importance and study design, types of cohort studies, that is prospective and retrospective studies, advantages and disadvantages of prospective and retrospective study. The observational studies try to measure or survey members of a sample about a specific phenomenon through observation without affecting them, that is under the natural environment. To be specific, an observational study draws inferences from a sample to a population where the independent variable is not under the control of the researcher, unlike experimental studies, because of ethical concerns or logistical constraints. In observational study, the investigator does not intervene and rather simply observes and assesses the strength of the relationship between an exposure and outcome variable of interest. This type of research draws conclusions by comparing subjects against a control group in case where the researcher has no control over the experiment. Observational studies have become more prominent in the fields of epidemiology, psychology, social work and other social sciences like population studies. Some of the types of observational studies are cross-sectional studies, cohort studies, cross-control studies, longitudinal studies or panel studies, ecological studies. We will discuss a few lines about each of these different types of studies. Attempts are also made to study the different variables that are likely to affect the phenomenon under study, but cause and effect relationships will not be established. In epidemiological terminology, these are known as prevalence studies, wherein the researcher examines the relationship between exposure and outcome prevalence in a defined population without regard to changes over time. Researchers take a measurement, that is example health condition of a problem at a single point in time, like a snapshot. In the field of population studies, all the gamut of surveys fall under this category, such as National Family Health Survey, district level health surveys, several other surveys or studies. Now we will move on to cohort studies. A cohort study is a research program that investigates a particular group with a certain trait. Cohort studies are based on the existence of a common characteristic, such as year of birth, that is birth cohort, or year of marriage, that is marriage cohort. For example, study of fertility behavior of all those women who got married during 2000 to 2005 and the marriage patterns of all those who were born during 1980-1985. While in the first case, all those women who got married during 2000 to 2005 have to be contacted and obtain information about the number of pregnancies they had and different outcomes of their pregnancies, whereas in the later case, one should study all those women who were born during 1980-85 and collect information about whether they remained single, if married, then the age at marriage, and any divorce or separation takes place, etc. Next we will learn about case control studies. These are mostly used in epidemiology, to some extent in population studies also, wherein two different groups differing in outcome, that is a particular disease, are identified and compared on the basis of some supposed causal attribute, prime cause for the disease. Here, those who have a disease are coined as cases, and those who do not have such a disease but belong to similar area are called as control. Researchers then look back into subjects' history, that is usually records or relying on subjects' recall, to learn about their exposure status. Studying the role of smoking in causing lung cancer is the best example for such type of studies. In population studies, these type of studies are mostly prominent in studying the prevalence of HIV/AIDS. Now we will move to the next type of studies. They are longitudinal studies or panel studies. These are another type of observational studies in which the data is gathered for the same subjects as in cohort study, repeatedly over a period of time, which may be some years or even decades depending upon the topic of interest and resources. At times, these are also called as observational studies, which generally focus on collecting data for repeated measures from the same sample at different points in time. Data collected at different time periods are known as waves. For example, in the recent period, the World Health Organization's study on global aging and adult health has been planned as a longitudinal study to collect data related to the aging process and the health and well-being of adults. Here, the sample consists of aged 50 years and older, sample of 65,984, and a smaller comparative sample of adults aged 18 to 49 years from a nationally representative sample in 6 countries, namely China, Ghana, India, Mexico, Russian Federation and South Africa. So far, wave 0, that is 2002 to 2004, wave 1 2007 to 2010 and wave 2 2014 to 15 have been completed, and wave 3 is going to be implemented in 2017. Next, we will understand about the ecological studies. These studies are intended to study the patterns of diseases or any phenomena and its related factors at the population level. That is, such studies usually defines groups by place, time or both. Thus, in these studies, the unit of analysis is community. Diseases, rates and exposure are measured in each of series of populations and their relations are examined. Often, the information about disease and exposure is abstracted from published statistics and therefore does not require expensive or time consuming data collection. The populations compared may be defined in various ways. In ecological studies, health outcomes are aggregates of individual health data. Example, prevalence and incidence of rates of disease. These studies mostly focus on assessing the health of population with their potential confounding variables such as demographic and socio-economic information at a district, state and country level. For example, public health and family welfare statistics are mostly using these type of studies. Now, we will discuss about the strength of observational studies. Observational studies provide data or information on real world or natural experimentation practice. Observational studies can be a reasonable alternative to randomized controlled trials. Observational studies help to formulate hypotheses to be tested in subsequent experiments. Observational studies provide part of the community level data needed to design more informative, realistic clinical trials. Observational studies can inform clinical practice. Observational studies are relatively inexpensive, and finally, observational studies are mostly less time consuming. Coming to the weaknesses of observational studies, the first and foremost one is various types of biases are likely to crop up either from researcher side or data obtained or data interpretation, like that. Some observational studies are expensive and time consuming. In observational studies, it is difficult to detect and determine the cause and effect relationships between exposure and outcome. Observational studies are subject to recall bias, that is biased on subject's memory and reports. In observational studies, selection of accurate and representative sample from the population is often difficult. After learning the observational studies, now we will move upon to cohort studies. Meaning wise, cohort studies are based on the experience of a common characteristic such as year of birth, that is birth cohort, or year of marriage, marriage cohort, etc. In the case of medicine, cohorts may be people who have taken a certain medication or have a medical condition for a period of time, say for a few days to few months. At times, the researcher may carry out the cohort study by dividing a cohort into subgroups. For example, a cohort of smokers could be subdivided with one group suffering from obesity and the other is not. In this respect, a cohort study is often interchangeable with the term naturalistic observation. The basic principle behind cohort studies is observing some phenomenon over a period of time among a group of people who have common trait. When it comes to study design of cohort studies, generally a well designed cohort study is likely to provide powerful results. In health related fields, in a cohort study, an outcome or disease free study population has to be first identified by the exposure or event of interest and followed over time until the disease or outcome of interest occurs. Since the exposure is identified before the outcome, cohort studies have a temporal framework to assess causality and thus have a potential to provide the strongest scientific evidence. The group of people usually sampled and enumerated, but sharing a different characteristic and who will be followed over time. For example, members of a birth cohort share the same year of birth. Then the researcher will collect information on exposure to the factor being studied and follows samples of exposed and unexposed people over time. The numbers of newly occurring, that is incidence cases of diseases, are recorded and compared between exposure groups. Two types of cohort studies are normally used in research parallels. The first one is prospective cohort study, the second one is retrospective cohort study. In the case of prospective cohort study, the researcher will select sample populations that have similar characteristics or traits and observe a particular outcome variable or phenomenon over a period of time, and thus the study becomes an ongoing process. To maintain validity, all the subjects must be initially free of the condition being tested for. Cohort analysis has been used most extensively in demography and our population sciences, especially in studies of fertility. When statistics show a rise in the total fertility rate over a given period, for example, cohort analysis may reveal that this results from a lowering of the cohort mean age of fertility rather than simply a rise in the cohort total fertility. One can also explore the role of other socioeconomic factors for such a change in fertility. When it comes to the advantages of prospective studies, prospective cohort studies generate excellent data about underlying trends in a population. Prospective cohort studies allows the researcher to measure any potential confounding variables or factors. In prospective cohort studies, temporal relationships can be established. Prospective cohort studies are good for studying rare exposure situations and multiple outcomes. In prospective cohort studies, it is possible for generalization of findings. Through prospective cohort studies, loss of follow-up cases can be recovered. The disadvantages of prospective cohort studies: prospective cohort studies usually require long period of time. They are also expensive and difficult. Prospective cohort studies need large sample size. In prospective cohort studies, it is difficult to select and maintain a non-exposed group. Likewise, the prospective cohort studies changes can occur over time in both expose and outcome assessment. Now we will move to the retrospective cohort study. In a retrospective cohort study, the researcher will select the sample populations that have similar characteristics, that is traits, but the outcome, that is fertility, marriage, disease, etc., already has taken place or occurs, which is followed by a look back at effect, possible exposure or causes for the occurrence of that particular outcome by classifying subjects based on their exposure status. As the focus of these studies is looking back after the phenomena has occurred, they are also known as historical cohort studies. In demography and population sciences, studies related to mortality and morbidity fall under this category. For example, one can look into infant mortality for a cohort of married women at present and then examining the plausible factors and effect over a period of time by backward looking. One can also carry out this type of cohort analysis by considering the records or registers maintained over a period of time. When it comes to the retrospective cohort studies are relatively inexpensive since the exposure and outcome already occurred. In retrospective cohort studies, the time to complete is usually short. The disadvantages side of these studies are In retrospective cohort studies, the investigator has no control over exposure or outcome assessment, as these studies depend on record keeping of others. In retrospective cohort studies, it is often difficult to determine the temporal relationship. For studying rare outcomes through retrospective cohort studies, large samples are required. Retrospective cohort studies, comparability between exposed and non-exposed groups is difficult to achieve. In sum, in this module, the discussion is made on observational and cohort studies and their related aspects such as meaning and importance of observation and cohort studies, types of observational and cohort studies, strength and weaknesses of observational studies, advantages and disadvantages of prospective and retrospective cohort studies. Thank you.